Antennas, when I first became a ham, were a mystery, total mystery. But I learned real quick, I could actually build one. I actually built a 10-meter wire antenna that I still have, and it actually still works. And I learned which end of the soldering iron to pick up. Did some of you have the same experience? But I've probably been through a dozen radios or more. I have, let's see, 2 or 3 here that I'll show. My current favorite radio is a base station radio, and I don't take it out of the shack. But I like going outdoors, and so a lot of the principles that Mark talked about have a key impact on my success. If I lack the power, well, forget that. I can look funny with my antennas and the radio, but I wouldn't be talking to anybody. So I would look on, and anybody disagree with this, power is the most mysterious aspect of the whole thing. I knew zero about batteries other than you put the plus in towards the plus and the minus towards the minus, and they run out of electrons way too fast. Oh, and they cost a lot of money. I use, for a lot of my handhelds, and I suspect a lot of you do as well, use AA batteries. And the reason I use AA batteries is because during an emergency, the first trucks in are going to be half filled with AA batteries. In the wildland fire arena, C and D batteries are very common, but a lot of the lights that people are using have shifted to the LED, and so they're AA's. Well, if you're going to work at night, you need light. And so AA batteries are going to be a big deal. And if your radio does not handle AA batteries, I would say, sorry about that. You're probably not going to be talking very long, and especially not at night. So that's one of the reasons why I do that. The antennas, I find I can inexpensively, unless you put up a tower, improve your signals substantially. And the radio, I would look on that as a fixed thing right now, because generally speaking, what radios you have is what radios you have. And it's dependent on budget, spousal approval, yeah, little details like that. And I could say also the antennas, to some extent, are also subject to spousal approval before you ever talk to the neighbors, the zoning people, your friends, etc. So, I want to talk on radios first. Number one is, if you look on the radio as a fixed item, there's 4 classes of radios that I've categorized here. Handheld, let's see, I have one here somewhere. It fits into this little zippered bag. Unfortunately, all of them come in basic black. By the way, did anybody know why Henry Ford chose black for his Model A's and Model T's?
So you can color you want.
Not cheap paint. Black paint dried faster. So they could move the cars faster on the line. And I didn't know that until a little while ago, and I found that fascinating. But the man was very frugal and very smart about what he did. So with these basic black bags, I have several things. I have the radio. I separate the power pack because I found that if you leave the, at least with my radios, if you leave the battery pack installed in the radio, those electrons tend to dissipate. They go somewhere, but not to any place useful for me. And so I separate them. I also have the antenna off the radio. That's one nice thing about ham radios. You can almost always take the antenna off of the radio. Not true for family radios and other things. So their output power is low, and they're very portable and light. Friends have used those at parades and stuff. I've used mine at parades. I've done other kinds of civic or public events. And a handheld is a wonderful tool for a lot of things. High power is not among them. And now an FM mobile, I think Mark had one here, and I meant to put some pictures in. I ran out of time. Anyway, you have moderate power. It's not as low as the handheld, and it typically is going to take 12 volts again, so a lot of the equipment that Mark was showing would be wonderful for an FM mobile. Now, the big advantage of a mobile radio is you have that big battery in the front of the vehicle, or unless you have a Tesla or something like that, or a Prius. But with that big battery, you can talk for a long time. Now, you may not be able to start the car if you talk too long. So that's another issue that you want to monitor. But you also have high power. I've been able to use the antenna, which I'll get to here in a moment, on my pickup, and I was heard up the Columbia Gorge 35 miles away. I think that's magic, to be honest, because if those of you who've driven along the Columbia Gorge notice it ain't straight. It winds around. And so that signal had to be bouncing off both sides of the gorge for somebody at a fairly low elevation to be able to hear my signal. And that was on the input side of a repeater. So that meant they were hearing me direct. Again, I say that's magic. And it was an antenna that was very similar to one of these. Nothing fancy. That's all locked in together, of course. So an antenna like this works very well for a mobile. It can also work well for a handheld, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, your base station, well, HF radio, let's just say that. This is an example of an early model 817, Yaesu 817. One big advantage of this particular radio, and that's also true of some of the Elecraft radios and others, is it does not require 12 volts. It'll work fine on 9 volts. My favorite radios really get irritable if you get down to about 11.5. Some of you know the model that starts with an I. And my favorite radio, but it doesn't like low voltage. It really quits talking very well. And a radio like that requires very low power. So if I had a 12 amp hour battery, I could probably talk 2 days with that radio. That's not true for my base station, however. Let's see, receive is 2 amps. Just turning it on takes 2 amps. And so if I have a fairly small amperage battery, like 12 amp hour battery, I might be able to talk 6 hours if I take it down to nothing. Probably don't want to do that, but you end up with high power requirements for the base station. So it's always a trade-off. And so I want to start with the radio because the radio sets what kind of antennas you might want to choose. With the handheld radio, let me pull this out. All of you have seen rubber ducks, and I'm going to regret that. I can't believe it. The antenna, there it is. Now, if you look at the size of this antenna, it doesn't have much surface area to capture the signal. It's really convenient, however, if I'm carrying it on my belt and I bend over a little bit, it doesn't poke me in the kidneys and all kinds of other places. I've seen some antennas that are about this long and it's always poking you in the armpit. Very inconvenient. So a short antenna has a lot of advantages. One of them is long range is not one of them. However, with an antenna like that, I once was on Larch Mountain west of Mount Hood, and I talked to someone simplex. It means I'm talking and listening on the same frequency, 60 miles. It's still magic. And I've read of an individual who went up Mount Whitney in California. That, by the way, is an effort. I got close to Mount Whitney, but I didn't want to brave the 30-mile-an-hour wind across an arete that was about this wide. So I saw Mount Whitney. But a guy went up there with a handheld radio like that and was talking to people in the San Francisco Bay Area 215 miles away with a handheld simplex. Talk about magic. And that was with a handheld antenna, rubber duck antenna, which has no gain. It's probably a negative gain, if anything else. So you can do all kinds of things, but as in real estate, location, location, location really matters. And during an emergency, how much of us have a choice about location? Probably zero. Maybe you're assigned to a place that's next to a bridge down in a valley. Well, you may be able to talk up valley and down valley, and that's it. So having another antenna choice would be really, really good. So another choice might be to get an adapter. Notice this PL259 will not fit on my handheld. My handheld requires an SMA. And so I need a PL259 to SMA for my antenna, or the connectors. And an antenna like this will actually do very, very well with a handheld. I've used this type of antenna with my handheld, because for a long time, that's all I owned was a handheld radio. Probably many of you are like that. Whereas once I put this on the car, don't need more power, but I have an outside antenna. Outside antenna makes a huge difference for low power especially. And notice it's not even 19 inches tall, which is nice. So let's see, let's get to another one. So convenient, short range. Now roll up J-pole. I've got one here somewhere. There it is. This thing rolls up like this. I think I purchased this from a vendor here at PAC a few years ago, and it cost me about $20. It's some twin lead. Those of you who are old enough to remember having antennas on the TV or outside, it's half twin lead, and then it goes to, in this case, a BNC, because that's what most of my radios are right now. And this is a very useful antenna to have in your Go pack, and it weighs maybe 4 ounces, maybe. Now, this is not very portable. A little story. A few years ago, my friend was camping near Talklock Lake off of Mount Adams, and my family was parked nearby. We couldn't talk with one another. We were maybe 3 or 4 miles away. As soon as I put this up in the tree, 2 things happened. Number 1, my antenna went up higher, so I had a bigger footprint, and 2, I had a better signal. And so we were easily able to converse simplex. But there were no repeaters around at all, so that made for an interesting challenge. Another type of antenna, especially if you like, and again, this is for FM. This is a 2 meter and 70 centimeter log periodic antenna. Notice the 2 bars here. The log periodic has a signal that will go from the outer one to the inner one to the outer one to the inner one to the outer one. Most of you who've had external TV antennas would recognize this sort of thing. That's a very common type of antenna. This one is very useful for talking with satellites. You aim the satellite, and it helps to know where to look. But if you've seen some opportunities to view the space station, International Space Station, you notice it moves really fast across the horizon. And they do have store forward capability on that for 2 meters. That's their backup radio, by the way, and which has had to be used a few times. Now, oddly enough, the connection is up front. So you have to have a coax cable that goes from the front to your handheld radio, which could be on your belt or someplace else. And because this is the antenna, it doesn't matter which orientation the handheld is. But if I aim this back here, I'm going to hear lots of signal there and nothing over here, or very little, and almost nothing behind either. And so if you're in a marginal place, this is a very nice antenna. And by the way, it all packs up in this little bag. I think it costs around $100, maybe a little more. This is an elk antenna, is the kind I have. I've seen Arrow antennas, and there's, I think, one other manufacturer that all are very good. They call them, the originals were called Arrow antennas because these are actually arrow shafts. Oh, let's see. Okay, so FM mobile, I like to having an FM mobile antenna. When Bob Heil, not the sound guy, but another guy, let's see, the second guy's name is HJEL, was working at one of the buildings near the 9/11 command center. He was the only ham radio operator on site, and he had a mobile antenna like this, and he was using fairly low power, but he toted everything in a wheeled cart that he had. And he was the only operator for, I think, 4 or 5 days, and operated for health and welfare and stuff. But one of the most common kinds of problems he had was not antenna related. Police and firemen would come to him because he was the only one who had tiny little screwdrivers that could fix eyeglasses. So you never know. Now, I don't know about you, but I think for a lot of hams, I'm not particularly adept at this, but the middle name of MacGyver, the guy that can solve the world with a paperclip. Well, I'm not quite that way, but I think many of us have abilities that are far beyond the typical skills of the general public. And now I've met a lot of folks who are very well educated. Some of them are so narrow that you get them 5 inches out of their area, they're worthless. But I think a lot of hams have the generalist approach. Now, I'm a forester by education, and my education is about this deep in a lot of areas, but I have to know a lot of areas. I have to know geology, soils, insects, at the moment cybernetic insects, but the other kinds of objects. I've laid out roads, I've fought fires, and I've done a whole bunch of things that many people never have an opportunity to do. I'm not special. It's just I've had those opportunities, and I dare say that many of you with your ham radio experience have experiences that the general public has no idea about. And in fact, I was talking with a lady today over at the Elks Club. She had no idea that there were about 200 hams, not counting the visitors that live in this county. And she had no idea. And it's an interesting aspect of how hidden we are from the general public. Until we put up antenna towers. Now, I have a little experience with that because I found that putting up antenna structures at home is a money pit. Talk to me offline about that. So I would say for if you're going to have a base station at home, something like this, excuse me, this is a fairly inexpensive one. I have no idea what brand this is. No idea. I might even say. No. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it looks like their kind of construction. Anyway, this has a gain of about 5 dB. And that's pretty decent. It means it's about 2, yeah, maybe dBi. I won't get in an argument about that. But basically, every time you increase the gain of it by 3 dB, you're doubling the effective power. So if you have a 2-watt FM handheld and you have something like this, you put out an effective signal that's 4 to 7 watts maybe, which gives you a bigger footprint. Also, this makes you more visible to the neighbors. So I would say one issue with this type, this does not require a ground plane because these act as the ground plane, but the mobile antenna does require a ground plane of some kind. It could be a pizza plate or something similar to that. You don't have to have it really fancy, and it doesn't have to be magnetic. So have any of you ever tried to put one of these on a glass car? I've seen them, but they have to do something underneath to be the ground plane.
So the antenna you were just holding in your hand, is it for mobile? Is it for a car?
No. This would go on a house.
Yeah. And what do you?
Or on a porch rail or something, but I would not put this antenna in a place where it's going to radiate at my level. I would put it above me. Excuse me, I'm going to poke holes in the ceiling. And here, that's the new part of the area. No, you want this up high. 2 reasons. One is it increases your footprint. If you look on, the signal is going to come off or be received at that height. You want it as high as you can. In my case, I'm hoping to put one of these antennas up that's at least double the height of this. I think it's a 10-foot antenna on the top of my mast, which is on top of a 48-foot tower. Yes?
Can we put those batteries on the floor while you're moving metal antennas around? I didn't want to have you short one right in front of you.
That would be exciting, electrifying.
But it might
Well, I'm probably not going to grab too many more things. So, but I appreciate your safety advice. Yeah, I do like to be safe.
1, 2, 3.
Well, that'd be one big burst of glory. So one of the challenges you run into with antennas for vehicle is that you need something that's wind resistant. I had a Saturn, beautiful little car. It's no longer with me, but I had a mobile antenna on it, and one day I heard this awful clatter. The antenna fell off. And it was totally destroyed. Going 65 miles an hour down the highway, and it was bouncing like tin cans off of a newlywed's car. And yeah, it was interesting. I saw the innards of it. So now, one advantage, by the way, of a mobile antenna, which you could do something at home on maybe a metal rail or something like that, is you get about 15 feet away, and that's invisible. Even though it's black, it's virtually invisible. And so I would recommend, if you're going to put something outdoors where you're not supposed to have things like this, paint them black for one, and put them in a place where most people won't see them. So with the base station antenna, if you put something like this that's fairly low on the back side of a house, I would dare say that's invisible from the front because it doesn't poke up over it. Now, most of the commercial antennas that you can buy, unless they're fairly thin, like that type of antenna, and that's a mobile type of antenna, they're white. Now, they will take paint, and that's what I would probably do. And I may do that with the antenna before we put it up on my, behind my house. So let's see. Now, keep in mind with an FM antenna for a base station, the taller the antenna, generally just leave it down there, just that the flatter the pattern. So if you have a very flat pattern that's going to be out horizontal, it won't have much signal up or down. That works great if you live in flat country like I do in Clark County, Washington. If I lived in Denver, however, that would be an absolutely lousy choice because the repeaters are close and they're high. And so you have to look at the geography. Now, some of the Puget Sound repeaters are fairly close. Like if you live near Mount Si, I wouldn't want a high gain antenna there because you don't need it. It's not very far away, and it's up high. The omnidirectional antennas that radiate equally poorly in all directions from the handheld is a good example because it has a really big signal. Now, one other type of antenna, and I'll come around here for safety. One other type of antenna that I've used for mobile HF is a hem stick. And this thing just screws together. Oh, and by the way, if I go into a university parking garage or something like this, I don't want my antennas showing. So I have this quick disconnect down at the bottom so I can pop it off, unscrew this, throw it in the trunk, and nobody knows the wiser. All they see is a little mount on the back of the trunk. And most people wouldn't have a clue what that is unless you know what it is. And so something like this is fairly modest cost. You could also build a dipole from this with, I have a pair of these. So I have a connector that has a way you can set up the antenna both directions, so I make a dipole. And it actually works quite well. Before I bought the buddy pole,
I use those on my rig for HF, and I'm having a blast with it.
oh yeah,
And on the dipole version, because you can buy that little kit like that makes it into a dipole.
right?
On field days, I have worked in the morning as soon as it starts off at 11 o'clock, work the East Coast, and from that time to 11:30 at night, where the signal disappears, I'm only getting local contacts.
Yeah, well, and that's the propagation. Now, one of the things that I will say from a mobile situation, I had one of these antennas, I won't poke the hole in the ceiling, attached to the back of my Saturn on my way to work out in Sandy, Oregon. And, and I had an antenna tuner in the trunk, and I talked to Ducey Island. That's magic. That's utter magic. That's 6,000 miles away from my car. And to do that from a mobile antenna is crazy. I really enjoyed that. Now, with the buddy pole, however, it's not a mobile type of antenna, but you can make all kinds of antennas. If you like playing with the antennas and experimenting, the kit is fairly spendy. I think it's 400, or maybe it's a little more now. But yeah, it's spendy, no question. But you can play games with it all day. You can try a V antenna, you can try dipoles, you can try verticals, you can try all kinds of things. Some of them will actually work.
You know, they also sell it to you one piece at a time, but it goes together much better than the car.
Yes. That's true. But you don't get the nice designer bag that I can't ever put back together.
They'll sell that to you too.
Oh yeah, I need the bigger bag. So at home, and this is also true if you operate out in the woods portable, and I'm thinking emergency kind of situation, a low power radio with wires, you can have an in-fed wire, you can have balanced dipoles, you can have an off-center fed dipole. I won't get into the kinds of issues you can have, but there's ways to be very effective with the antennas. And The variety is absolutely stunning. It all comes back. If you have no power, though, it really doesn't matter what kind of antenna you have. So now, one other type of antenna that I would recommend you consider, especially if you're very interested in emergencies, is an NVIS, a Nevis antenna. With NVIS, I've heard stations on 80 meters in San Diego. I have not talked with stations on my Nevis antenna in San Diego. But the fact that I can hear and talk of about 400-mile radius from where I am is amazing. That works very, very well if you have a regional kind of thing. So if something's going on the west side, like an earthquake or something like this, I could talk to Spokane, I could talk to Yakima, maybe Pendleton and other places where they might have resources and stuff. That's very, very helpful to do. The mag loop antenna is also another antenna that I have no experience with, but some of my friends do, and they love them. They're also very HOA friendly because you can use them indoors. And they work fairly well. They're kind of weird looking, big loop of coax, but it works. And so with the HF antennas, if you have an emergency and you have a way to be able to tap into the antenna with a low power radio, you might be in really good position. I heard a story about a fellow who during Katrina was isolated. Now the neighbors were isolated as well with him. They had a big island, and they wanted out of that island because they were starting to run out of food. The only way they could figure out was go talk to Mr. Ham down the block. He tried his VHF radios. Well, since all the FM repeaters were flattened due to the hurricane or out of power or other reasons, he could not raise anybody. So he got on his HF radio, and a ham in Portland, Oregon picked up that signal. Now we're talking 2,500 miles. The ham in Portland, you'd say, oh, he's not going to be able to rescue those folks, but he actually did, because he got the information, enough information to tell FEMA in Indiana where they were. They relayed that to the Coast Guard, and about 3 hours later they were rescued. So never underestimate the ability of your use of antennas and equipment to be able to help somebody out. Your friends and neighbors may depend on you, and I would urge you to learn the skills that will help you. You may not have the MacGyver title, I sure don't, but some will. You'll have skills that other people do not. And so I appreciate your time. And your antenna choices are going to depend on your radios and your budget and spousal approval. That's critical.